We're going to be continuing a series today, and featuring my coffee. I'm going to stay right there. We're going to continue our series today on the names of God. Now, our software is still rebelling against me, like me in particular. Our tech team having no problems. Me, no. So, I don't have my fancy title slide up there, unfortunately. But without that, do you guys remember, by chance, what the series is about? The names of God. Yeah. Remember the title slide? It's like, hello, my name is, and then we put like the name of God. It's like super cute, right? Really clever, right? Good job, Jason. No, and we've done a couple weeks of those now. Do we remember any of them? Do you remember any of the names? And not necessarily the Hebrew, but like what it means in English. God of peace. Yeah, Yahweh Shalom. I do remember that one in Hebrew. Yeah. The God of peace. Huh? The God of seeing, or the God who sees me, or something along those lines, right? Yeah, the story of Hagar, Ishmael's mother. Any other names? Do you remember any of the other ones? The God who is. He is Yahweh. God of truth. El Emet. The God of truth. Because truth, morality, where does it come from? It comes from the Lord, not from society, not from the changing whims of those around us. It comes from the Lord, and it can be discovered in here, right? Yeah, those are a few of the names that we studied. Actually, we might have gotten all of them. I wasn't keeping track, I wasn't counting as we went along. We've discovered these names of God, or rediscovered these names of God that are contained within the scriptures, and actually one name that isn't attributed to God, Yahweh Shalom, that's attributed actually to an altar to the Lord, but there's a tradition that picked up from there. Really fun little story, right? And from each one of these names, we've learned a basic truth of Christianity. From the name Yahweh, He is, we learned that there is only one God. That's like baseline, basic principle of Christianity. There is one God deserving of your worship. We learned from El Emet that God is truth, that the morality that we should live by comes from the Lord, not from society, not from a place of convenience, but morality comes from the Lord. The way that you should live your life, what is right and wrong, is determined by God. That is another basic belief of Christianity. From Yahweh Shalom, we learned that God brings completeness, He brings wholeness, that He makes things to function the way that they are supposed to function, and that we can trust that because of all the times that He's shown up in each one of our lives, just like the judge Gideon did. From each one of these names, we've learned a basic truth about Christianity, and today will be no different. We will be studying another name of God, Yahweh Rapha, the Lord that heals. And we'll be discovering another truth. Now, last week, as we studied that name, the God of seeing, the God who sees me, the thing that we discovered is that even when there are individuals who are cast out, who are mistreated, like Hagar was by Abraham and by Sarah, that God still sees and understands their suffering, which is great. Many of us have people that we have relationships with that we go to when we just need a vent about something, right? We just need them to understand us, whether it's a big thing or a little thing. Maybe it's one of your parents or a spouse or a friend or somebody. For some of you, it may even be one of your kids, hopefully adult kids. But you may be someone in your life that you call when you just need to tell them about it. You know they can't fix it. You just need them to see you, to understand you, right? I do this with Maggie all the time. My parents sometimes will call me when there's something going on over in Virginia and something with the family, and like obviously you can't go immediately to the person that you're ticked at, so they call me because they're like, you're a pastor, you can deal with it, right? So they call me, they kind of vent to me about it and talk to me about it, and if they want advice, I give advice. If they don't want advice, then I keep my hands off because I know better. But everyone in our lives needs somebody who just sees, who just understands, someone we can talk to about the things that are going on. We don't expect them to fix it. We need them to see us. And God can certainly be that person. Actually, with Hagar, He more or less was. He didn't promise an end to her suffering, but He still asked a hard thing from her. But He was a God who sees, a God who understood. And later on, down the line, He blessed Ishmael and caused Ishmael to be the ancestor, the father of many peoples. But there are some situations where you need more than just someone who understands. Eddie, you broke your heel a little while back. It was very unpleasant, right? And you went to a doctor, right? Now imagine you walked into that doctor's office and you said, I fell off a ladder and I broke my heel and it really hurts and I can't walk and I need help. And the doctor said, I see you. And then left the room. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rank that kind of doctor? 0. On a scale of 1 to 10, you don't even get on the scale, right? Because when you go to a doctor, you're expecting them not just to see you, not just to understand you, you're expecting them to fix something like a broken leg. If you went to a tax expert, right? You went to someone to do your taxes for you, and they looked through all of your W-2s and whatever other documents that you have, and as they look through your W-2s and your 1099s and all this sorts of stuff, it's tax season, so that's what's on the brain right now. And they looked through all this stuff, and they said, wow, that's really interesting. And then, okay, that'll be $500. They never filled out anything for you. Would you be very happy with that individual? No, because you went to them for them to do something, not just to see you, not just to understand, wow, it really sucks that you're going to have to pay $2,000 this year. Bye. Like, you're not coming for that, right? You're coming for them to do something for you. In the same way, there are times in our lives where it is sufficient for God to see us, for God to show up beside the desert road like he did for Hagar, just to understand what is going on in our life and maybe even to challenge us to stand up under the challenges that we face. We don't need him to necessarily interfere. We just need to know that he's there. Sometimes that's all God needs to do. But sometimes we need God to do something. We need God to act. We need him to be a doctor. We need him to be a tax expert. We need him to do something for us. And he wouldn't much be a God worth worshiping if he never did. This name that we're going to study today, Yahweh Rapha, speaks to that. This is a God that we worship that acts. We're going to find the story where this name is first bestowed on him in Exodus chapter 15. I got my fake leather Bible, again, up here. I'm going to be reading out of this, but the words will also be up on the screen. If you want to follow along in whatever Bible you have with you, whether it's paper or electronic, it's going to be Exodus chapter 15. Not starting at the beginning of the chapter, but actually beginning in verse 22. In Exodus 15, beginning in verse 22. That first verse there says, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went over to the desert of Shur. Does that sound familiar? The same place where Hagar was last week, interestingly. Decades, actually probably centuries later, the same exact place. They went over to the desert of Shur, and for 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. Do we have any Old Testament historians in here? Or any giant Bible nerds? Mitch! What happens right before this passage, Mitchell? They just left Egypt, and they went through the Red Sea. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, the story goes something like this. There's this guy named Moses. He was born in Hebrew, and there was an order from the Pharaoh of Egypt to execute all Hebrew males. This is exceedingly harsh, but not an unheard of punishment because, well, the Hebrews were enslaved. And in ancient societies, when an entire population was enslaved and the population grew too large, it was common to further oppress or even cull the population to prevent the threat of an uprising, specifically to kill the males, because they would be the ones who would fight if there were to be a military rebellion. If you study the history of the Greek city-state of Sparta, right, really famous because that movie 300, which is horrifically historically inaccurate, it has really cool fight scenes in it. But anyways, if you study the actual history of that city-state, they have a similar situation come up where they have too many slaves and not enough soldiers, and the slaves figure out, wait, there's more of us and less of them, and maybe we can actually win if we start a fight. And they begin treating their slaves very harshly afterwards to prevent further rebellions, including even sometimes killing the males when there's too many of them. And this is what Egypt does. They see this massive population of Hebrews who they are keeping as slaves and go, wait, there's more of them than there is of us. And if we don't do something about this, they're going to rebel, and that's going to end poorly for us. So they start killing the male children. It's horrific. But it is a strategy employed by a lot of oppressive peoples in the ancient world. And Moses is one of these boys. He's born during this period. But we read in the scriptures that there are Hebrew midwives, people who would help with births, that refused to kill the children as they were ordered to. They simply refused to because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. And so Hebrew population kept increasing. Eventually, when Moses was born, his mother put him in a reed basket and popped him down the river, just floated him down the river, hoping someone was going to pick him up. And someone did. And that someone was actually a member of Pharaoh's household, which is interesting because this Hebrew boy was adopted into the king of Egypt's household and was raised as royalty. But he knew who he was. He knew that he was a Hebrew, and he had a problem with the oppression of his people. And so when he saw a Hebrew slave being beaten by an Egyptian, he ran over and struck the Egyptian slave driver with a stone and killed him. Now, he may be a member of the royal family, but he's also a murderer. And so he fled to avoid punishment and spent several decades in the land of Midian. Eventually, God appeared to him. There's a whole burning bush thing that's a really wild story you should go read. It's in the book of Exodus. And he speaks to God in the form of a bush that's on fire but doesn't burn up. Very strange passage. And God tells him to go back to Egypt. And so he does, and there's this whole thing with the 10 plagues where eventually Pharaoh, even though he's really stubborn at first, gives up and says, you know what, fine, I'm going to let the Hebrews go. I'm going to let this population of slaves leave the country just as you and your God has demanded. And they're walking away from Egypt. They're leaving this country that's oppressed them for so long. And Pharaoh has a change of heart. And he decides, you know what? I'm not going to let them go. I'm going to chase after them. And so he does, him and a large portion of his army. And they come up to the sea, the Red Sea, just east of Egypt, going into the Arabian Peninsula. And God leads his people up to this place, and then they look around and they realize, okay, wait. So there's this huge sea in front of us, and there's this giant army behind us, and where are we supposed to go now? Because if they catch us, this isn't going to end well. And God says, don't panic. Moses, stretch your staff out over the waters, and they will part, and you will walk through on dry land. And they do. It's amazing. It's a miraculous thing that happens. He stretches his staff out, and the Red Sea parts, and they walk through on dry land. And then after the last of the Hebrews get through, the Egyptian army tries to follow them, and God allows the waters to crash down on the army, wiping them out and assuring the Hebrews that they would be able to escape without further Egyptian interference. That's the situation we're walking out of. That's a pretty big story, right? God shows up in a lot of places. He brings the 10 plagues. He speaks to Moses. He takes an exile and turns him into a savior of his people. And even the fact that the child survived after being stuck in a basket and floated down the river. Like, that's amazing. God shows up in a lot of places, in little ways and in big ways, all over the place in this story. And then they come to the desert of Shur, and they travel for 3 days with no water. And finally, they arrive at a spring. And all this is still fresh. They've seen God move in their life in amazing ways. And they come to this spring. And wouldn't you guess that the spring is not exactly what they expect? So they get there in verse 23, and it says this. It says, when they came to Mara, that word means bitter. When they came to the spring that is called bitter, they could not drink the water because it was bitter. Go figure. That is why the place is called Mara. So the people grumbled against Moses and said, what are we to drink? I love this. I love this because God has shown up in so many miraculous, amazing, huge ways in these people's lives, even just within the last couple of weeks. And they come up to some water that doesn't taste good. And the use of the word bitter here, it might imply that it was just so bitter that it couldn't be drank. It might mean that it was poisonous. It also might even mean that it was sharp tasting in the sense of it was salty. It might have been a saltwater spring. The word, as with most words in Hebrew, is fairly vague. Whatever it was, this water was not drinkable. Whether it just tasted so badly, or it was so salty, or it was even poisonous, we don't know. But it couldn't be drank. And after 3 days traveling in the wilderness with elderly and with children and with beasts of burden like donkeys and oxen and maybe camels or whatever, the camels were fine, but everyone else really needed a drink of water. And they come to the spring. This is how you travel across the Arabian Peninsula. You'd go from spring to spring and from well to well, because cutting straight across was exceedingly dangerous. It was very easy to run out of water. And if you're going to attempt that, you would do it only with a large stock of water, which apparently the Israelites did not have, and only with fit fighting age males, and only with camels for livestock, animals that could last through this trot through the desert. And even then, it was exceedingly dangerous, and a lot of people didn't succeed. So you'd bounce from water source to water source. So if you get to a water source and it is undrinkable, that means what? You're in trouble. You're going to be thirsty. You're going to be very thirsty. Vultures are going to get a meal soon, a very large meal. They're in trouble. And so they turn to Moses and they say, what are we going to drink? Now, the reason why I think this is hilarious is because I've seen God show up so many times before. It seems like such a small thing to ask. Be like, hey, Moses, can you go talk to God and ask him to clean up the water for us? But no, what are we going to drink? You've let us out here to die, Moses. What's wrong with you? That's their response. And I would say it's really easy to judge them here. But think about how many times we have the same response. Well, I don't know about you guys for certain, but I would assume, because I know that's my response. Story time? Small story. Small story time. In order, in most places, to become a preacher, it requires a certain amount of school. You have to go to places where there are very, very smart people who spent their entire life studying the Bible, and they teach you how to read the Bible and how to explain it to other people and how to run a nonprofit organization and all of those fun things that you have to know how to do if you're going to be a preacher. It is very worthwhile. We call these places Bible colleges and seminaries, which is a really fun, fancy-sounding word. I had to go to one of those. It was out in Missouri in the middle of a cornfield. I actually asked one of the founders of the school why it was located where it was, and he said because there's nothing for the students to get into trouble doing here. Which is true. And I'm very grateful for my time there. The issue is schools require money to run, and that money comes from the students. Which means you have to pay. You have to pay to attend school, right? Most of us do. If you're one of the lucky people that got to attend school for free because either your parents paid for it or because you got scholarships or grants or whatever, good for you. That is awesome. I was not one of those people. So I had to pay out of my own pocket and take out loans and stuff like that to pay for school. And I remember in the run-up to going out before my freshman year, actually when I didn't even know what school I was going to go to, I was convinced I was going to go to Liberty University in Virginia. It's in Lynchburg, Virginia, like an hour and a half from where my parents live. Convinced I was going to go there, and they were like twice the price of the school I ended up going to. And I remember having this rant to my dad. I don't even remember what brought it up, but I was just like yelling. I wasn't mad at him. I was just mad. And I was just yelling to him, and he got it. Like, my dad's a smart guy, and he was just kind of like nodding. I know you watch these. I don't know if you remember this at all. But I remember just yelling to him about, like, they say they're a Christian college, and they just want money, and I can't afford this, and if this is what I'm supposed to do, like, I was so mad. Like, 18-year-old angst, right? So angry. 4.5 years later, graduated with my undergrad. Somehow, some way, through hard work and sweat and tears and loans, I paid for school. If that's where God wanted me, he was going to provide a way. And I should have known that. Even 18, I should have known that. But I just didn't. Like, that's a small thing, right? That's a small thing. Relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of things, that's a small thing. But it was huge to me. Because I was convinced, like, God wants me to be a preacher. And then I looked at the money, and I was like, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to afford this. And God provided a way through the generosity of relatives, through the opportunity to work in various places, through student loans, through all that. God provided a way. Fast forward, though, to in spring semester, my senior year. And I pull out of the residency that I was convinced I was going to go to next year, earn my master's, and get some experience and all that. And all the jobs that I'm interviewing for call me back and say, hey, we're not going to hire right now because of COVID. And I go from having 4 or 5 potential job prospects to 0. And then I get a call from a California number. I thought this church was in California at first because Russ called me on his work phone. I was like, that sounds awesome. Get a call from a guy named Russ Ward. He says, hey, got your resume from Gary Johnson. We would like to interview you for an opening for senior minister position. I said, oh, awesome. Where in California are you? He said, nope. It's Southern Illinois. I said, all right, I guess don't have any other options. And what, a month, 2 months later, I was hired and getting ready to move out here without ever having visited the town. I was convinced that I had no job prospects, and yet I turned up here. Now, in both these situations, I should have known better, especially the second time around. God had already provided for me once, so why didn't I believe he could do it again? Well, the Israelites are in the same boat. God had provided for them once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times. It's just something in human nature that we start doubting God even when he's provided for us before. So it's easy to judge him, but I assume that all of you guys have stories like that too. God's provided for you in the past, in one way or another. But the next time that the tiniest inconvenience comes up, we go, God, why have you forsaken me? Right? It's amazing. It's just this weird little part of our psyche. But it's the way that we function. It's easy to judge the Israelites, but we would be standing in the same place. We'd be looking at Moses and saying, what are we to drink? So Moses has the perfect response. He cries out to the Lord. And the Lord showed him a piece of wood. That's a really weird sentence. Here is this branch, Moses. Okay. And Moses threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instructed for them and put them to the test. Actually, we'll pause on that. Let's just talk about the water and that wood for a minute. Whether the water is salty or just so bitter that it can't be drank or whatever, I've heard this explanation, I've read it in very reputable commentaries, that maybe this piece of wood was a part of a very aromatic shrub or tree. And when it's thrown into the bitter water, then it has some sort of chemical reaction that cleans the water. And no. And here's why I don't believe that. Now, God can do whatever he wants. But here's why I don't believe that that's what happened. If you go home and you get a lemon, and you squeeze a lemon into a glass, or 2 or 3, and you just get a whole 8-ounce glass of lemon juice, okay? Try to drink it. Now, some of you freaks will like that. You'd get along with my sister, because she'll drink straight up lemon juice too. Most of us would be like, oh, it's just so tart, it's so sour, you just don't want to drink that. Okay. So by the logic that this was an aromatic shrub that cleaned the water, get a stick of cinnamon and throw a stick of cinnamon into the lemon juice and then try to drink it. And you know what it'll taste like? Cinnamony lemon juice. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't make it clean. There's water in the lemon juice. There's lots of water in the lemon juice. But that aromatic shrub is not going to clean the water. This is a miracle. The water is undrinkable, and then God shows Moses his piece of wood and says, throw it into the spring, and it will make it drinkable, and he does, and the water becomes drinkable. And why on earth does God have him do it? Because God could have just snapped his finger and cleaned the water, right? Look at the ministry of Jesus. When the centurion comes to him and says, my daughter is dying, and then someone comes to him and says, don't bother the master anymore because your daughter's already dead, he snaps his fingers, and doesn't even snap his fingers, he just says, your faith has made her well. He doesn't even come to her. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't do some sort of ritual. He nothing. He just says, from potentially miles away, he says, your daughter is well. It says he was amazed by the faith of the centurion, then it says that your daughter is well. Jesus does nothing. He just, metaphorically, snaps his fingers, and the lady is healed. But there's another time when he's talking to a blind man, and he picks up some dirt off the ground and spits in it, which is gross, and then rubs up some mud in his hands and smears it on his eyes and says, go and wash the mud off of your eyes. And when the man does that, then suddenly he can see. So why is it the one time Jesus just says, yeah, no, she's good, go ahead, your faith has made her well, and another time he smears spit mud on somebody's eyes and makes them go and wash before they're healed? Why? Here's my best guess. There are times in the scriptures when somebody prays and it just says, and so-and-so prayed. There are other times that it says that they prayed on their knees. There are other times it says that they prayed prostrate on the ground. Prostrate, the second R is very important, okay? I heard that story. I'm not going to say any names. I heard that story, though. About a fourth of the congregation thinks that's hilarious and everyone else is confused. That's okay. That's okay. There are different positions that people pray in, sometimes standing up, sometimes on their knees, sometimes on their face on the ground. People pray in all sorts of different positions. So why does it matter? Because a prayer is a prayer is a prayer, and God is the same God no matter how you pray, right? That's true. But sometimes you just need to do something. Sometimes you need to turn your hands up. Sometimes during worship you need to do a Russ, right? Raise that one hand. Sometimes you need to get really Pentecostal. Throw both your hands up. God has created us in such a way that we are a unity of spirit and of body. That what is immaterial about us and what is physical about us are connected. And the things that we do with our body actually change the way that we think and change the way that we speak and change the way that we feel. And I think the reason why sometimes in miracles God asks his prophets and his representatives and the recipients of miracles to do certain things to enact the miracle is not because he needs to, he doesn't have to. But because he knows that when you're forced to do something, even a small symbolic gesture, that it reinforces spiritual truths. So what's being reinforced here? Maybe that God chooses to act through people, because God could have just snapped his fingers and cleaned the water and it would have been fine. But instead he asks one of his prophets, the first prophet, Moses, to cast some wood into the water, to just do a small symbolic act. Some people see here a forward-facing prophecy about the cross, because there is a piece of wood later that would heal not just the waters, but heal our souls. So maybe, I think that one's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but it's possible. Maybe God just needed the people to see something happen. Could have done an invisible miracle, and maybe they would have drank the water and gone, we were just imagining the bitterness. We were just imagining the salt. We were just imagining this drink was not drinkable. And they needed to see something happen so they knew that in this moment God moved, that God did something on your behalf. Maybe it's all of the above. But sometimes God asks people to move, to do certain things, not because he has to, but for your benefit, my benefit. so that his people can see things happening, so they can shape them spiritually. So the Lord cleans the water. And then it says that he issued a ruling and instructed them and put them to the test. And he says this in verse 26. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and if you keep all his decrees, I will not bring you any of the diseases I brought to the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you. Or in Hebrew, I am Yahweh Rapha. Now it's interesting in the context here. God didn't just heal a lame man or give sight to the blind. There's a story later where the people sin and they're bitten by poisonous snakes, and he heals them from the venom of the snakes. It's nothing like that, though. He heals the water. He makes bitter water sweet to drink or potable. And before that, he parted the waters and saved people from the Egyptians. And before that, he brought 10 plagues to free them from Egypt in the first place. And before that, he spoke to an exile and a murderer to bring him back to Egypt to lead his people out. God acted in a lot of ways, but none of these are normally what we would call healings. They are acts of God. And the kind of healing I think that God brings is a little more all-encompassing than healing a broken leg, although he certainly can do that, right? Or a little more all-encompassing than healing some messed up lungs, although he certainly can do that. A little more all-encompassing than taking cancer away from someone, although he certainly can do that. I think the point of this story and the point of this name, Yahweh Rapha, the Lord that heals, is that our God is a God that is still capable and willing of acting on behalf of his people. Whether that's healing a spring so they can have water in the desert, or preventing their former captors from giving chase, whether it's clearing the way into Canaan for his chosen people, or whether it's preserving the church even in a day and age that is not exactly beneficial to church growth. Regardless of the situation, how major or how minor the miracle, God acts. We began the sermon talking about how there are some friends, some people in your life, family members, whatever, that you go to just when you need to vent. We just need someone to see you, and God sometimes is that person. He is the God who sees, who understands, who empathizes. But God is also Yahweh Rapha, the God who heals, the God who acts, the God who can still do miraculous things. That is the core concept of Christianity we learn from this name. That our God is a God who can act, even miraculously, on our behalf. Before we wrap up today, though, I need to acknowledge something. That is that many times he chooses not to. There are amazing stories we read in Scripture. Jesus, at least 2 times, raises a dead person. One time he interrupts a funeral procession and brings the individual back to life. Another time he raises his friend Lazarus, and that's not counting the time that he himself came back from the dead. But during the time of Jesus' ministry, which was around about 3 years long, although his whole life was somewhere in the range of 33 years, how many people do you think died in Judea? Thousands? Tens of thousands, maybe? I'm not sure how densely populated the area was at that time, but a lot. So if he saved 2, brought them back to life, and by the way, they would have died again later anyways. If he brought 2 out of 200,000 back to life, that means there was 199,998 disappointed individuals in Judea. You ever thought about that? God could have brought each and every one of them back from the dead, but he didn't. Our God is a God who can act. Sometimes he chooses not to. And I think from that we can derive some wisdom from the book of Job and from the book of Revelation. I was actually talking to Larry about this just this morning. In the book of Job, God's response, one of my favorite responses in all of Scripture, to Job complaining that he does not deserve the suffering that he has taken, his response is, you don't understand what I'm doing. Paraphrased. That you're too small, that your viewpoint is too low to understand the good that I'm bringing out of your sorrow. And you may not see it in this lifetime, but you will eventually see it. So simply trust me. And in the book of Revelation, we're promised that no matter what suffering we go through in this lifetime, that eventually God will set the record straight. come disease or war or famine, whether you die at a young age or at an old age, that eventually God will set the record straight. So God may not always choose to act, but he's still God we can trust. He's still God capable of acting when it benefits his kingdom, when it brings glory to his name, when it brings his people from one era to the next. Our God is a God who acts. Our God is a God of miracles. Our God is a God who heals. He is Yahweh. That's a lesson we find here in Exodus. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for being a God who is willing to act. And thank you for your wisdom when you choose not to. If it were up to us, we would always get our way. We would heal every person, bring every dead person back from the grave. And God, while that sounds like utopia, that sounds perfect, that sounds wonderful to us, we know that you, knowing so much more than we know, seeing so much more than we see, that you have reasons for permitting the things that you permit, for acting when you choose to act. So help us to trust you, to trust that when your name and your kingdom depends on it, that you will act, that you will heal, that you will move on behalf of your people. And that when it is more beneficial to the church and to the glory of your name not to move, that you won't. Help us to be okay with that. God, we adore you. Help us to understand you better, to empathize with the reasons that you behave in the ways that you do. In Jesus' name, for your glory and the increase in your church.